Hey, patrons.
Hey, patrons. It's another late night recording, late Thursday nights with Why We Do What We Do.
That time of year, travel and shit's happening.
It's crazy.
Just got to record when we can record.
Yeah, I mean, we just make it work because that's who we are as people.
That is who we are. It's a fact. All right. Video games.
Hell yeah. Can't wait to talk about Doom.
Oh yeah, Diablo, whatever, the new Diablo game coming out.
Oh yeah, Diablo 4. Dude,
yeah.
I have not seen any of the gameplay. I've only seen ads, and all the ads are just people that are like, they seem like they're tortured going, will you help us eliminate evil? And I'm like, yeah, this rules. I'll play it. So
nice. I've seen those.
You've seen those? They're awesome.
Yeah. I did end up getting a Switch and Tears of the Kingdom. I know.
How is it?
It's been super fun. I've been really enjoying it so far. I'm kind of at a point where I'm a little bit stuck and I'm not totally sure what to do next, but like I have two things I know that I could be working on, so I'm just going to do those until I figure out what else I'm supposed to do. But
okay. I'm in the middle of, I went back to revisit Link to the Past. So I've been playing that on my Switch.
Oh, nice.
Dude, it's so fucking good. Like that game is so good. And it was one that I didn't play until I was an adult. My brother was obsessed with it. And I was like, I don't know, why does anybody like Zelda? And I'm playing it. I'm like, good Lord, this game is so good. But yeah, I don't know if you've set it up, but like if you get like Nintendo Online, if you get their subscription, you get free access to like you get like downloadable apps that get Sega, N64, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and like there are these like these apps that you download that you get a bunch of free games on them.
Oh, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, so it's like this is like if you go into the store, like if you have it online and you go into the store, they're all the apps are free and all the games they update them like every month you get new games on it.
Cool. All right. Well,
so just so you have that information, whatever, do that what you will.
I might do something with that.
That's what I'm playing. That's what I'm playing Link to the Past on. This is the Super Nintendo app. Yeah. And awesome. Super Mario World is on there and all the fun stuff.
Awesome. Love that.
Hell yeah.
All right. All incredibly on par with what we're talking about. So I believe that this comes out June 7th, like right around the corner.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because we're cutting it close on stuff right now.
We're very rapid turnarounds. June 7th. Yep. National Tailors Day. Oh, Pride Month. That definitely needs to be the first thing.
Yeah. Do you want me to type these in?
Sure.
Okay, so we'll do days. Pride Month.
Yep.
Okay.
It is National Chocolate Ice Cream Day.
I like that. Okay.
Global Running Day.
Global Running Day. I don't like that. You like that.
I like that. National VCR Day.
Oh. That's a very specific day.
National Tailors Day.
Okay, like clothing tailors?
Like clothing tailors, yeah.
All right.
And it is Love Your Burial Ground Week.
Is that just like people who take care of cemeteries?
That's a good question. Let me open it really quick. But we're not dead. Learn about the history of your local burial grounds and join others in exploring what these somber plots of land can tell us about the past and its inhabitants.
So I will say that's actually very cool. Like some of the symbolism and stuff on the tombstones are like really fascinating. When I was in Providence one time, I got to see H.P. Lovecraft's grave.
Oh, wow.
Really cool.
All right.
Yeah. Tiny, gross racist man. But like his gravesite was really small. It just like kind of very unassuming.
Huh. No Cthulhu monsters or anything?
No Cthulhu monsters. People would leave stuff on his, like, they would leave like little toys and stuff on his gravestone though.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then maybe we'll do one or two of the months. So it's National Candy Month.
Okay.
And National Iced Tea Month.
I mean, it's a really good day, it seems like, and good month. Like June seems great.
There are a few more on here we won't include right now but that I do like. So there's like Great Outdoors Month, Soul Food Month, Care for Your Grandparents Month, Guitars on the Beach, and there's a picture of a guitar being washed over by waves.
Oh, weird. It's just like a bunch of people playing Jack Johnson covers. I hate it. You know how many times I have to hear Curious George? Oh my God.
Then we got Audiobook Month, National PTSD Awareness Month, Mud Month, and Camping Month, and Dairy Month.
Dairy Month. Oh, I don't like that.
Yeah, same.
We don't need that one.
Yeah.
So now that we brought up Jack Johnson, I wonder if I could still play that song. Wait. Nope, that's not it. Nope, that's not it. I kind of know it.
Yeah.
I borrowed my brother's guitar because I started writing a bunch of like really doomy ISIS stuff, like ISIS riffs. It's like really heavy, like scary sludge metal stuff, and that guitar fucking rules. Like I'm gonna try to steal it from him.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, ready to do this?
All right, I'm ready when you are, my friend.
Count us down. 3, 2, 1, go. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your 2-bit host, Abraham.
And I'm your first-person shooter host, Shane.
Nice. We're a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do, why they do them, things that animals do sometimes, general psychological phenomenon, and pretty much everything interesting there is to know about human behavior ever.
Yes. And today we're going to talk about a phenomenon that people seem to be really upset about and seem to kind of keep going back to, very similar to like the satanic panic and, you know, all kinds of things that come up. And I think this is one of those ones that is so fun because the subject itself is already fun.
Right.
And then we just get to dispel a bunch of myths. So this is the kind of episodes I like. Nerdy things, dispelling myths. Life is good.
Inherent fun. Like that's just, we're all about it. And so that is the thing. This episode is going to come out on June 7th, which is some things notable for us to celebrate and acknowledge. The very first thing I would like to shout out is that it is Pride Month. So happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month. Yay. We are in full support of this. And so what I would say is I wish every month was Pride Month. And also don't be jerks, you know. We realize that people are in danger. So, you know, support legislation that supports folks that belong to marginalized populations.
Yeah. Love thy neighbor because it doesn't matter who they love.
Yeah. So, and also Jesus had 2 dads. So, you know, I mean, everybody gets upset about that and they forget that part.
Indeed. It is also National Chocolate Ice Cream Day and Global Running Day. Those seem a little bit incompatible, but maybe you can make it work.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, good luck. I hope it's going to be a messy run or uncomfortable. It's also National VCR Day, which, you know, as children of the 80s and 90s, big fans of that. Outdated technology. It's also National Tailor's Day, which I've been to a tailor exactly one time, and now those pants don't fit me anymore.
Yeah, growing old. That's a thing.
It sucks.
There's also Love Your. Which one is that? I forget now. Maybe I don't remember.
I think it's
Love.
It might have been Love Your.
Okay.
Yeah, I typed that wrong.
No worries. Love Your Burial Ground Week, which has a delightfully macabre sort of feel to it. But it has to do with, you know, respecting and acknowledging and sort of going out and appreciating the intricacies of our past as they are represented by tombstones, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, super cool symbolism, and go back to listen to our episode about burials because we did a whole one on why people bury people. So it's a fun episode.
A lot of information there.
Yeah, it's also National Candy Month. As a big fan of candy, I like this, and it's also National Iced Tea Month. But like, I think it's really important to pin this down. Iced tea is fine. Sweet tea is where it's at. As a Southerner, it should be National Sweet Tea Month.
There probably is like a national sweet tea something or other acknowledgement, but I'm a fan of the iced tea, not a Southerner, so I've had the sweet Southern iced tea, and it is really good. And when I choose iced tea, I tend to choose not sweet iced tea, but I do understand the appeal.
So every restaurant that I ever worked at had a version of sweet tea that would make, and the amount of sugar that is put in it is it. I'm surprised that the sugar industry is not bankrupt. It is. I mean, I'm not joking when I say like 2-3 full cups into a pitcher of iced tea. It's
Sure.
bonkers.
Yeah.
It's wild.
I think it's what's keeping the sugar industry afloat is the iced tea industry is
Dentistry
buying
too.
their. Yeah, there you go. Indeed. But we're actually not talking about iced tea, believe it or not. We're talking about something else. And I'd like to set the scene here by telling a story. And I would like to make sure that we begin with trigger warning. This story does include violence, particularly gun violence. And that is not the context for this entire episode. But if that is something you are uncomfortable hearing, you'll probably want to skip ahead a few minutes where we start to get into the meat of this topic. But that's what we'll be starting with. So let's set the context here.
Yes. So it is probably already 90 degrees at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, August 3rd, 2019. It's a place that is very hot. What many people were already there shopping, or were maybe just bored and needed something to do, or maybe they were trying to get out of the day's already mounting heat. And Patrick Wood Crucius, a 20 Crucius, maybe, right? Is it pretty Crucius maybe. Or Crucius? All right. Crucius, we'll say, a 21-year-old who must have driven all night, or perhaps arrived a few days before from his home nearly 700 miles away in Allen, Texas, a suburb of Dallas, pulled into the Walmart parking lot wearing ear protection and carrying a WASR-10 rifle and started shooting.
Yeah, and he actually started shooting right as he is into the parking lot. The manager who saw the shooting begin announced a code brown to signal to employees to start evacuating customers due to the active shooter. Crucius sounds like that curse from Harry Potter. Is that what? Oh, Crucio is what it is. Oh, it's similar. Okay,
close enough.
Yeah, Crucius entered the store and proceeded to murder 23 people and injure another 23. And of course, he was arrested, charged, and convicted for murder and hate crimes.
Yes. Now, in response, then President Donald Trump said from the White House, quote, "We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. It is too easy today for troubled youth to surround themselves with a culture that celebrates violence. We must stop or substantially reduce this, and it has to begin immediately," end quote. Side note real quick, shocking that any of that was a complete sentence.
True. I was actually going to see if you had a good Donald Trump impersonation voice that you could try.
I have opted out because I just hate him so much. Like, it is one of those things where I have like such an intense rage towards this human, if you can even call him that I can't even, like, I guess it would be the closest to be like, because I don't think that he says words, but that's my thought on him. So sorry, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. That's my bias.
We're clear on our bias, I think. Yeah. All right. So that's his response. Current Speaker of the House, although he wasn't at the time, Kevin McCarthy has similarly echoed the sentiment, saying, quote, "But the idea of these video games that dehumanize individuals to have a game of shooting individuals and others, I've always felt that is a problem for future generations and others. We've watched from studies shown before of what it does to individuals," end quote. Now, I'm glad that you mentioned the studies, Kevin. Let's take a look at those, shall we?
Yes, but before we go forward, a few more things that we need to know about Patrick Wood Crucius. So prior to his cowardly, pathetic, bigoted, disgusting murder spree, Kevin posted Kevin or Patrick?
Whoops, Patrick. Thank you. Good catch.
All right. I was like, wait a second. All right. Kevin could have done it too.
They probably, yeah.
It could have been either. All right. So I'm gonna start that one all over. All right. Prior to his cowardly, pathetic, bigoted, disgusting murder spree, Patrick posted a manifesto to the 8chan subreddit in which he outlines his white nationalist and anti-immigration beliefs, including the, quote, great replacement, end quote, hypothesis, shared and pushed by the likes of Donald Trump and Kevin McCarthy and Dilbert creator Scott Adams, apparently, of all people. Awful. It's a weird thing. So this was a targeted spree aimed at killing people of Mexican descent and probably allies to them.
Doesn't sound like video games had much to do with it, but I digress. There is a lot we could unpack with video games. There's the effects on the brain, video game addiction, even creative ways that video games have been used to teach and socialize people, wacky, weird things that people have done with video games. I've actually seen, a conference presentation and linking video games and behavior science. And all, there's a ton there. I mean, this could be an entire podcast where every episode, all we do is discuss things about video games because there's so much content. But today we're focusing on the putative relationship between video games and violent behavior that politicians and others love to claim exists.
Yeah, so there are many video games depict stunningly lifelike scenarios in which the player is incentivized to wield deadly weapons against other players and NPCs, or non-playable characters, for those of you who don't play video games. And they have gotten so incredibly realistic that if you were to simply glance at a video game without knowing what it was, it would be understandable if you thought it was a video of real body cam footage, which is a thing that just happened. There's a video game that recently came out that was filmed from body cam footage, that perspective, and it had like the player aggressively beating up criminals, like, and it was so lifelike that there were people that were like, the ethics of this are weird, and that was kind of where that went.
Did you see the Unreal Engine 5 video game thing that they did, sort of a proof of concept, someone like going into like this abandoned warehouse?
Yeah.
I mean, wild. It is shockingly like I actually think that there's at a point now where you could not make it look more real. It is as real as a video game. Like, it looks just like footage, like, unbelievably so.
But we all played Tony Hawk 1. And so, like, we know how real that was. So, you know what I mean? Like, I think it couldn't really get more real than that. Seeing somebody skate around in a circle for an hour and a half because you got a perfect balance code. I mean, but like, I will say this. To be fair, Tony Hawk did like create like a whole situation where like now skateboarders are like totally bonkers. Like, it's wild to watch skateboarding now because everybody was like, Tony Hawk did it, we could do it.
Fair enough. All right, so bias, I need to sort of just get this on the table. I don't really play video games that much. I've started to sort of get back into it and dip my toes into it, but I do love them. I think we're both people who really enjoy video games, who have played a lot of video games, and I'm actually personally very thrilled that there are so many video games, so many different kinds of video games.
Yes,
but I would be convinced with sufficient evidence, if video games were in fact linked to violent behavior, that would not be an appropriate way to go, and that we should maybe do something about it if the evidence was there. Because as a scientist, I'm always open to the data and the research, and I follow where the data tell me to go.
Yeah, and as a video game player myself, I also was never very good at like the more realistic ones. So like, you'll catch me playing, as we were talking about before the show, Link to the Past or Sonic the Hedgehog, or stuff from Sega and Super Nintendo and all that. And then every now and again, like the Switch games have been really cool. So so that's my bias too. But I also grew up playing Mortal Kombat, and I haven't killed anybody yet. So
same,
just a thought.
Yeah. And actually, that kind of leads us to a history of violence in video games. So let's start to unpack and walk through the timeline here, and understanding violence in video games and what that's meant, what it's been, and how people have responded to it.
I love this graph that you included in the notes. Like, this is really cool data.
Yeah. That one's going to be, we're going to be referencing this graph that depicts sort of violent crime in the United States over time. We're going to be referencing that a lot as we go through this.
Yes. So let's start in 1976. So we had talked about this a little bit in the Tough on Crime episode, and we've kind of covered this a little bit. But in 1976, violent crime had been on a consistent increase for decades. And so 1976 is the first year it decreases even a little bit. And it doesn't decrease by much. But at the time, a very simple 2-bit graphic game called Death Race is one of the first controversial violent games that's ever been released. It is a black background, and there are 2 white 2D kinds of car-shaped things that would run over humanoid-shaped gremlins. And what parents found so concerning about this is that when the player ran over the gremlin, it would make a sound, and a little gravestone would appear, which is actually pretty interesting. I like that. Like there's so little technology in this, like it's so little programming, but it's like enough that they were like, you know what we should do? We should program a tombstone here. I think that's great.
And I think the image I saw is actually like a little cross that pops up where they were run
Uh-huh.
over. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, these are very, very crude shapes. I mean, they have very little detail. It's basically a side scroll, but moving forward, an up scroll so that the top of the screen is like where you're headed toward, if you will. And so these little
Yeah.
gunman things come at you. But anyway, because of this sound and the tombstones that would appear that appeared just too gruesome to the parents of the time, they really pressured heavily to have this video game removed, and it was successfully removed from stores. And if only they had any idea what was coming in violent video games.
They had no idea. Yeah. Now, in 1983, violent crime had continued to surge in the United States, and for a second time, it decreased slightly for a few years from about 1980 to 1984. A game called Custer's Revenge is released in 1983, and in this game, a Custer character runs from the arrows of Native Americans and proceeds to, trigger warning, rape a Native American woman tied to a pole for points. And this game is protested and it flops, and no one could find that type of behavior in the game amusing or fun. And I'm glad the game just is not around. Like like that's just not a good situation.
Yeah, good riddance. Let's not do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
All right, 1993, we kick into high gear with the violent video games available. We get 3 video games in 1993 that are specifically worth mentioning. The first one, Night Trap. In this game, the players are trying to save a woman from being captured and killed by monsters. Of course, the problem that people have with Night Trap is not the fact that there's violence, and there's not the fact that there's victimization of women. It's the fact that the women are scantily clad in these little nightgowns and their pajamas and whatnot. So,
Yeah.
So that's one. Doom is another one that comes out at this time. This is the first person shooter depicting graphic, bloody explosions of monsters as you basically walk through hell killing things.
Yeah. If you've never played, you're killing demons in hell. That's what the whole game is.
Yeah, I mean, it could be called Constantine, but they called it Doom.
Yeah.
There's a Mortal Kombat, and this is the first video game to feature realistic, lifelike violence done to humans. Side note, I'm not sure how realistic or lifelike any of that was, but it's the first thing that I guess came that close to it. So there's that.
Yeah, it was one of the first games, or it was like the first game to have like character actors be in the game. Like, so when the models are like actual humans and actual actors that they filmed and put into the game versus like having sprites and stuff. So that in itself was like, oh, they're actually hurting humans, and it wasn't really that bad.
Although, side note, and you played this and I didn't, so I tried to capture some images from Night Trap to include in our notes here, and it looks like that one was also filmed, and so you as the player are sort of choosing. It's like a choose your own adventure, how the scene plays out, sort of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's like a point and click kind of like problem solving game, and it is filmed with like real life actors. But when you look at it again, this came out in 1993, but it was filmed in the 80s, so it's very dated. Like everything looks like it's the 80s, and like the whole thing is you're supposed to set booby traps and stuff in the game to like prevent these monsters or these people breaking into your house from like hurting people. Like that's really the whole game. It's basically like Home Alone for adults, but like nobody's naked, so.
Well, but they were scantily clad, and all 3 of these
that's
games,
enough.
Yeah, that was the problem, because all 3 of these were brought before Congress. They were in congressional hearings, but the only one that was pulled from shelves was Night Trap.
It's so weird. So Sega had a Mortal Kombat version that they like when you punch people, they wouldn't bleed. They would just like throw sweat off of them. So like you could enter. Sega got around it though, because you could enter a blood code, and then you had blood in the game in the first Mortal Kombat. Yeah, so censored, except for there was a cheat code. So, but also Mortal Kombat is not realistic at all. It's so. I mean, you're talking about people that throw flaming skulls at each other.
Right.
But all of this led to something called the ESRB. And so this is a video game rating board that ended up kind of establishing rules and guidelines for content moderation in video games. And so that's when you say like T for teens on video games, that's the ESRB stuff.
Yep. Now, at this point, violent video games are just exploding on the market. There are tons of them. They're selling extremely well. They're very popular. They're making it into lots of homes. 1995, U.S. violent crimes are gently but steadily declining. And this game comes out called Phantasmagoria. This is also a bloody sex crime game depicting violence of women. Similarly and rightfully, I think, pulled from shelves for its violent depictions.
Yes. So also and this is something that like has come up multiple times across multiple episodes, and I think it's worth pointing out here as a quick side note. When we do talk about violence, it is important to note that ads are also violent. So I apologize that we're imparting this violence on you, but here are some ads.
That was great. I was just thinking, oh, we need a segue. And I was like, how are we going to do that? And then you just pulled it right out from underneath. It's great.
That's I have my moments.
We are back. So we've been talking about the history of violence in video games, and we just covered up through 1995, and we're moving on from that. We got into 1995. At this point, there are way too many games to even attempt to summarize them all that are out. But we've got things like Doom, Quake, Castle Wolfenstein, Redneck Rampage, Nightmare Creatures, and Resident Evil. And this is the point at which someone brings the first lawsuit against video games.
Did you ever play Castle Wolfenstein?
I did, actually. That was one of the few on this list I have played. That game was super fun. I mean, it was bonkers, but it was super fun.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. If you know what, I'm not going to spoil it for everybody. Listeners, dear listeners, go look at Castle Wolfenstein and see what it is. It is absurd. Now, in 1998, is the first release of Grand Theft Auto, which really revolutionizes the idea in a mainstream way of what video games can be. It's incredibly popular, and sequels and additional games immediately go into development. I mean, I remember in the 2000s playing Vice City nonstop. It was one of those games that was like it took the world by storm. But 1998 is the first edition of Grand Theft Auto.
Yep. Okay, 1999. This is another trigger warning for people who have a hard time hearing depictions of gun violence, understandably. This is a short one, so maybe, I don't know, a minute in the head. All right, so 1999, two students at Columbine High School in Colorado go on a shooting spree of their school. And then it turns out later that they found that the students were big fans of the Doom game, as most people were, which causes a frenzied panic about video game violence in relation to violent crime. And although this was a horrific tragedy, it should be noted at this point, violent crime in the U.S. is the lowest it had been since the 1970s.
Right. I mean, and that's a huge thing. And also, there was a lot of pre-planning and stuff before they showed up. So
yeah,
it's hard to say that like there was and we'll talk about some of the studies and stuff, but Doom is not the problem. They were not going to hell. Now, in 2001, under pressure from Congress and the public, the Surgeon General is tasked with conducting empirical research to determine the extent to which violent video games cause violent behavior. And in its study, returns a few important findings. And this is kind of where we're going to start getting into some interesting data. A, video games have no discernible impact on violent behavior. This was a study done in 2001. Okay.
Right.
B, media depictions may have some impact, but it is very small, only about 2% on average. And C, the most significant risk factors are home life and mental stability. I want to make sure that we pay attention to that mental stability piece too, because that is a current argument about gun violence as well.
Yes, that is true. Okay, so we're at 2001, and I think we're going to have to kind of skip ahead a little bit. Suffice it to say that over the next couple of decades, despite an exponentially growing population, exponential growth of availability and sales of violent video games, rates of violence and violent crime in the United States continues to tick downwards to the lowest levels seen since the 1960s. Interestingly, and this is just correlational, so there's no reason to think this is causal, but I still think it's interesting. If you look at the data, whenever there is an increase in video game sales, there's a small decrease in violent crime. And whenever there is a slump in video game sales, there's a small increase in violent crime. So
yeah,
I mean, just take it how you will. I think it's just worth noting that like I include this little graph here, like you see the biggest jumps in video game sales are correlated just correlated, not saying they're causally related, but just food for thought, correlated with the biggest decreases in violent crime and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, you see, like, just on this graph, if I look at 2010, 2011, 2012, like those are the 3 data points that stick out to me the most. You see there is a certain amount in 2010, video game or like violent crimes are low. Sales increase in 2011 and violent crimes decrease, and then sales decrease in 2012 and there's a slight increase in violent crimes. Super interesting stuff.
Or like if you're looking at the very first time we saw a decrease in video game sales in 2005, this graph starts at 1998, is the first time that violent crimes actually tick up from the trend that they had been on. So they had been decreasing until 2004, and 2005 video game sales decrease, violent crime slightly increases.
So odd. So interesting.
Just a weird correlation. I thought it was useful to point out.
Food for thought. Food for thought. Now, meanwhile, some states successfully, temporarily, are able to ban or limit the sales of violent video games, and these end up being struck down in court for multiple reasons. Sometimes it's like, interfering with businesses. Sometimes it's freedom of speech. Like there's all kinds of stuff that kind of like get involved here. So a lot of times those violent video games were still able to make it out into the market.
Yeah, and also nearly impossible to regulate. Like if a state that banned it next door, the state didn't, people just crossed the border and picked that up in a different state, and it like had no effect whatsoever, Or at this point, like people are it's getting easier and easier to order things online. Like they'll just order it online, and it's like that's not something they can easily regulate. So many politicians, parents, academicians, if you will, speak out against violent video games. And meanwhile, the scientists and psychologists continue to run study after study and are finding no link between playing violent video games and violent behavior. Not really, but we will dig into what some of the research that Kevin was talking about might have.
Some of those studies. But I think it's important to note too, violent crimes only started to increase again in 2016. Was there anything major that happened in 2016 that we are not aware of, or that maybe is slipping my mind? I can't think of anything in particular that would have led to that.
What happened in 2016? I don't know.
I don't know either. I guess we'll never know. But I think it's worth asking, and you kind of already alluded to this. We should ask everybody, have you played video games? I played video games my whole life. I had a Sega, had a PlayStation. I was obsessed with Tony Hawk. Like I never played the games that were like more violent games. Like I was really good at Mortal Kombat, but I didn't really like fighting games. I liked platformers. I liked Sonic the Hedgehog. I liked Super Mario Brothers. I liked and I liked Tony Hawk a lot, and Crash Bandicoot. Like I played those games a lot when I was a kid. And so I never really got into, I think we had a PlayStation 2 and I kind of left it, like that's where my video game kind of stuff left. Like I left it there. And then when I got kids, I started playing the Wii again, which was like, okay, I'm like sword fighting on an island with people, but it's not real swords, with Wii Sports. But like that's my experience playing video games in general. Like I played all of those, and I'm gonna tell you right now, playing Sonic the Hedgehog did not make me run faster, and it did not make me destroy robots. So
my two of the ones I probably played the most is I played a lot of Mario. I loved Mario, pretty much anything. And I also loved Halo when it came out on Xbox. Halo was a big thing. I played through at least the first 3 Halo games. I played pretty religiously, campaign and multiplayer and whatever. I loved all the Halo stuff. And I also was a pretty big fan of Resident Evil, and specifically, I really liked the Resident Evil games. They were very puzzly. It was like, find a thing that goes with the thing, so you can open the thing to get to the next thing you need to find to finish this other. And there's a lot of this like collecting stuff to solve these little puzzles in the game, and that I really enjoyed. And then just the zombie theme is one that I've talked about before, is something I really enjoyed. So I liked all of those. So the first person shooter of Halo, I did play a little Call of Duty, but it was not like a major thing for me. I was much more into the synthetic Halo world. I thought was a really fun concept, so that's why I enjoyed that one so much.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. See, I was always like, I was never very good at like pointing and aiming. Like there were some games that came out that were really cool. Like I remember being super stoked about Metal Gear Solid, thinking it was really fun to hide in a cardboard box. I remember Grand Theft Auto coming out, and not because I could like run people over or hurt people, but because you could steal cars and just hit ramps and stuff. Like that was more fun to me, right?
Yeah.
Like the Twisted Metal was an example of that, where it's like
Yeah.
it's just a ridiculous, over the top game where you're like, there was never a point in time where I was like, you know what I should do? I should go get an ice cream truck and put a rocket launcher in it. Like
Yeah.
there was never, like it's one of those things where I always had fun, but it's like, to me, it's like movies where it's like, it's fake. Like you don't, like you suspend belief while you're playing it, but then when you go back to reality, you're like, it's fine.
Yeah. That's a great comparison, actually, and I feel very similarly. And yeah, I had the same thing. Is like I liked I like this sort of, I don't know, it's like problem solving, puzzle solving a little bit, that sort of thing about it. But also, yeah, as I got, and I actually feel like we've sort of danced around this idea of playing violent video games. Like I thought they were a lot of fun, the ones that I did play,
Yeah.
but I abhor violence. I would call myself a pacifist, a mildly extreme one.
Yeah.
If that's sort of an oxymoron, mildly extreme. um, but anyway, that was at least my experience with it. But that's very anecdotal. We should ask science. What do you say, science?
Yeah. So in this moment, I will stand in as science. So for one thing, and this is what science sounds like to me. For one thing, it's difficult to do research on this because so many people play video games. You don't have good controls in place, and particularly among populations of interest, it's very difficult to gather that information, get those people into the studies. But I think it's worth asking the question of like, what is the argument here? And essentially the argument is that people are saying the violence in video games primes aggressive behavior, that it functions as a practice.
As a practice, you guys.
Okay. All right. Beep.
Or
It functions as a practice or a habit building around violent action, and that it desensitizes people to violence and lowers morality. That's what people are kind of arguing. Like, it makes you want to be more aggressive. It gives you practice and habit forming activities to make you more aggressive or around violent action, and it makes you like care about violent action less. And the priming is like giving someone a relation ahead of time, some kind of like experience ahead of time that is likely, excuse me, beep, that is likely to affect them in the future. For example, I randomly say strings and then asked you to name an instrument. You are likely to say a guitar or a violin or a mandolin, maybe.
Yeah, as opposed to something like a trumpet or a drum or something like that. And it's just because the relation you have is strings. And even though you weren't thinking, oh, I should name the string instrument, it was just like, that is now part of what's at strength when asked to come up with something random. And so it's more likely to be. And that's actually how some of the mentalism magic tricks work, is they'll do a lot of priming to get you to say or choose something very specific. Now,
right.
Again, so we're digging into the research part of this, the science. As we said in 2001, the Surgeon General conducted research which turned up no connection. The data not only don't correlate, they're actually inversely related, as we mentioned earlier, as we're talking about
super important to note.
Yes. And so let's go ahead and go into some of the studies, and because there are studies that seem to suggest this link between violent video games and violent behavior through that priming effect. And so we're gonna have to talk through a few of those really quick. There was a 2018 study that found that there was an increase in violent behavior among teens who played violent video games, specifically that they were more likely to be sent to the principal's office or get in fights. It's important to note when looking at this research, the effect was tiny. It was technically statistically significant, but there was very, very small change in the group that was more likely to. It was like 2% more likely to than the other group or something. And so just leaving out the actual number, they just say more likely to it. It sounds like a lot. It really wasn't a lot. It was just technically statistically significant. The other important feature of this study was that although they showed they were more likely to get in trouble, there was no association whatsoever between playing violent video games and violent crime.
Okay. That's okay. So that's a good place to start. Now, several other studies also found causal links between violent video games and violent behavior. Mostly things like hypothetical scenarios, brainwaves, and heart rate. They found that, but never actual correlations to violent crimes. And that's really interesting to point out. There was never never a causal link to violent crimes or even correlational. Interestingly, almost every one of them was from the same author, Craig Anderson. And Anderson has been on a crusade against video games since 2007, producing study after study after study showing how exposure to violent video games cause violent behaviors.
Yeah.
However,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. And so just to sort of talk a little bit more about this, because I don't know if I plan to bring it up again, but as I said, it was hypothetical. It was like after playing violent video games, they would ask questions like, would you be willing to, if someone took something from you, squirt them with a water bottle or even give them an electric shock? They didn't do those things. They didn't even pretend like they were doing those things. They gave them that hypothetical situation of like, do you think that you would do those things right now? And they saw that there was an increase in people saying that yes, they would, was basically how they did it. So, and again, there was no actual association between actual behavior. It was all that hypothetical stuff.
That's so wild to me. Now, we'll say this, okay? So, like, going on, Anderson and his cronies, I feel like cronies is a good word. Minions is another good word too. But like his folks, his research people, cronies, minions, whatever you want to call them, they have been heavily and widely criticized by the scientific community for overstating his claims, as well as a myopic interpretation of his data. Basically, what they're saying is they're making sweeping generalizations about data that they have a very particular bias towards.
Yeah. They kind of just did their best to line up to get the results that they wanted, and everyone's sort of calling BS on that. But I think it's probably worth also unpacking what the word myopic means.
Myopic is a really good word. I
right?
Really, it's one of my favorites.
Nice.
I don't use it nearly often enough. So let me get a good definition for you all, because I am terrible at defining things off the cuff. So one definition of myopic is nearsighted.
I mean,
but the one that we're using, metaphorically, yeah. So the actual definition that we're looking at here, though, is lacking imagination, foresight, or intellectual insight. And the way that I kind of look at it is like myopic is it's very it's very narrowed. Like, you know, you it's like you almost like got blinders on. You can't see any other data, or you're not willing to see any other data because you are like, you lack the intellectual insight to consider any other options.
Yeah, I very frequently use it and hear it used to say like narrow-minded, so hyper-focused on like what you want to see that you don't see anything else.
Yeah, it's like another way to look is like single-sighted, right? Like a cyclops, like you wouldn't say cyclopic, you'd say the cyclops was myopic.
I believe so.
I don't know. I don't know. I just made that up.
Speaking of,
I just wanted to figure out how to talk about cyclopses. Cyclopi, cyclops,
cyclopides.
Cyclopeans.
All right, we need to figure out what the correct plural of cyclopeousness is, and in the meantime, and speaking of lack of intellectualism, here are some ads.
All right, hold on 1 second.
No,
let me take my meds.
Deliver on that promise.
Okay, I got it. We're good.
Cyclopes.
Cyclopes.
Cyclopes. Oh, you're right. Cyclopes. Okay. Where the hell are we? I got lost. Oh, there we are. Okay, cool. All right. Beep. All right. So as promised, we have learned that the plural of cyclops is apparently cyclopes, or that's at least the generally agreed upon plural.
Yeah, I don't like that.
If you were just joining, I don't know how you'd just be joining us right now, but if you were somehow just joining us, you'd be not, I don't think you would realize that we were talking about video games, but we are. We just happen to also be talking about cyclopes.
Yeah, it's a wild time over here at Why We Do What We Do. Okay, so real quick before we go on, I think this is probably just going to be one episode, right? Like, it's like the way where we're at, like there's a lot more to cover.
Yeah. No, you're right. We've covered like half of it at least, and we're only like 30 minutes in, so we're probably fine.
Yeah. All right. So, talking about the literature around violence in video games, the literature on this doesn't actually and couldn't actually measure violence. So, and you'll find this is like the case with like a lot of violent crimes. A lot of times it's very difficult to study violent crimes because they usually only happen once. And so like, because they only happened once, you can't identify trends among individuals. You have to look at like other things, and it doesn't really, it's like very difficult. But what they do typically is, because they can't measure actual violence, they measure proxies. And one proxy was to ask about thoughts and feelings related to violence. And like you just mentioned before the ad, they were asking people after they played video games and about violent video games, they're asking them whether or not they would do something that would be considered violent.
Yeah, and actually, so I couldn't remember if we were going to bring this up again, but essentially, you're right that what they did is they had players in groups where the one group played violent games, the other one played non-violent games. Then they created a mock or hypothetical situation in which they asked the players to think of harming someone by either blasting them with a loud sound or making them eat hot sauce. Though that was their violence that they did to them, right? They never saw another person to have these things done to them. They did not witness or directly inflict any harm or see any effects of harm. They were just asked about these and these hypothetical scenarios. And so
Sure.
that also to me seems, I mean, eating hot sauce seems fundamentally different from shooting someone. To me,
Yeah.
at least. Maybe someone else sees them as being similar, but I think they're different.
A little bit.
Yeah. And there's probably, it's not worth doing a really deep sidebar on this right now, but there is probably a conversation to be had about how people are to one another when they're not face to face. So if I asked about like, would you do this to X person that you don't like, you'd be much more willing to not face to face that person, say, yes, I would do harm to that person. Versus when you actually talk to someone, it's really hard to bring that level of cruelty to another person when you're standing face to face with them. And this is actually kind of similar to road rage. We see other people as cars and not as people. And like, people obviously do get, and they'll get out and they'll yell at each other and they'll get in fights and horrible things have happened. But in my experience, limited as it is, and as biased coming from me as it is like when you actually are talking to someone face to face, I'm not screaming them, calling them names, even if I'm mad at them. Right. Like I'm having to sort of problem solve the situation. And I think that that's a normal thing to do. Probably.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm unique.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's like a humane thing to do.
Yeah.
But I think as we kind of unpack this, I think one of the most important things to unpack and have a discussion around is that one A, whatever you want to call it, we'll say thoughts and actions are not the same in a fundamentally important way. We often think and say things when we are frustrated or in any state of high stress that we do not act on. Okay, that's important. And B, the effect of people reported more violent thoughts only lasted between about 4 to 30 minutes. It was temporary. And so watching a sad movie might also make you temporarily sad, but it doesn't cause depression. And I think that's an important thing. These are fleeting, passing emotional moments. I will say this too. When you're talking about like psychological intervention, a lot of times, like one of the core fundamental things about like doing therapy is that you understand the fundamental difference between thoughts, actions, and feelings. Like they all produce different responses and when you're kind of like examining them. And so they are fundamentally different. Emotional responses versus logical responses versus behavioral responses are three very different things.
Yeah.
And they teach that in basic psychology interventions. So I'm shocked that like psychologists are like missing that.
Well, the myopic anti-video game activists are missing it.
Yeah, for sure.
Another trigger warning for gun violence. This is a sort of single point here. So again, short. After the Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, the media jumped all over the report that the shooter at the Sandy Hook was a huge video game player. However, although he did have some of the standard, what you might call violent video games, such as Call of Duty, what they didn't really report, and a lot of people didn't think about, was his favorite game that he played far and above everything else. And what I saw in one place is as much as 10 hours per day was Dance Dance Revolution. Now, that's not
very different
general category of violent video games that I'm aware of.
I mean, unless you are into dance fighting.
Okay. Is that something you can do in Dance Dance?
I don't think you can do it in Dance Dance, but you can do it if you are part of West Side Story.
Okay.
Or Grease. Sure. I feel like they fought in Grease.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay.
I don't know, but I think that's an important point. Like, so it's not like if your argument is violent video games, then we have provided there are multiple cases where that has not been the situation. Like Dance Dance Revolution is not a causal thing for video games, for like, I'm sorry, for shootings. Doesn't make any sense. And again, I think this goes back to the idea that other scientists have largely found the opposite results to the small cadre of anti-video game activists such as Anderson. And one study on priming in video games had players play a game depicting driving and avoiding collisions on a road, and another in which the players were a mouse avoiding a cat. And what the researchers hypothesized, that based on priming, the player should more quickly recognize words associated with the genre of the game they were playing. Makes sense, right? So you're playing a game where you're cat and mouse, you're going to recognize words that are related to that. So another example, to say it another way, players of the driving game should be faster at associating words related to their game categories, such as keys, wheels, road signs for driving, and leash, toy, and food scraps for cat and mouse games. But not only did the players not have faster reaction times to the related words, they were slower at the related words than non-related words, indicating a negative priming effect. So the opposite of priming in that situation, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So like, whereas the other ones were indirectly measuring priming by creating a hypothetical scenario unrelated to what they were doing. I mean, except abstractly. In this one, they created a direct priming comparison of like to like, where you should have had basically a very easy, observable, robust effect, and they didn't get it. And that was because what that means is that there was not a robust effect, and that priming is not happening, at least not in the way that those other people were hypothesizing that it would.
Right. Right.
And these kind of go in order. The next one is a 2007 meta-analysis that found significant publication bias in the studies that were likely to get published if they had a positive correlation rather than studies that had a negative one, meaning that when these studies were being done and showed no connection between video games and violence, they weren't being published as often as the ones that were showing that correlation.
That is super important, because that's telling you that, like, you know, there's research out there, but it's not showing what like what's actually happening. Now, a 2007 experiment randomized 103 young adults into groups of no video games and non-violent video games. Violent video games where the player is a good guy, and violent video games in which the player is a bad guy. So you've got 4 groups there. Afterward, they exposed the players to a frustration task, one designed to frustrate the participant, which is just sounds like a personal hell for me. And they found that the players with the most history with violent video games were less likely to exhibit hostile behaviors during the frustration task. So this is what this study found. This study found that they put people in different categories. They intentionally frustrated people, and the people with the least violent or hostile behaviors were the people that played violent video games.
Yeah, and who had like the longest history of playing violent video games as well.
Yeah.
So because it actually didn't even matter what group they were necessarily a part of, if they had a long history of playing violent video games, and whether or not they were just less likely to exhibit hostile behaviors when you tried to frustrate them after playing a lot of those games.
Right.
We're still in 2007. 2007 Swedish study reviewed 161 papers on violence in video games. Without going into it in depth, the short summary is that most studies did not attempt to control for factors that were the most likely to impact the violent behavior, or they had other methodological flaws that made them impossible to interpret in any meaningful way. One of the more interesting findings in this was that they were looking at one of the more interesting findings was when they looked at 12 longitudinal studies, and obviously most people are going to know, but that just means they collected data over many years to look for trends over time. But only 3 of those 12 studies included data about mental health and home life. And 2 of those 3 found that those factors accounted for violence and the video games did not. So out of 161 papers, they didn't even look at mental health as a relevant factor for violence. And in the ones that did, that was the factor that accounted for violence.
Amazing. I mean, and that's a huge amount of papers to do. Like, because I was just reading a meta-analysis that was like, they looked at 900 papers and ended up with 18 that they could review.
Yeah.
You know, like
that happens
for
a lot.
them to, yeah. And so you're talking 161 that were included in the study. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Now,
the longitudinal part is really, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The longitudinal part is really important because then that actually looks at, like, maybe people say, okay, well, maybe it looks like it's fleeting because it's short term. You play a game and then you test them and they don't really show violence, but maybe the effect compounds over time. And we now have two studies showing that that's not the case. That the longer that they go on, the less likely they have any history with violence, actual violent behavior.
Amazing. Amazing. All right. So 2012, a study found that 6,500 eighth graders, I'm sorry, beep. In 2012, a study found of 6,500 eighth graders, it found that when you controlled for things like home life stability, a history of trauma, and challenging behavior and mental health, any associations between violent video games and violence shrank significantly. So you found that, like, oh, there were these other things, home and mental health, that led to more violence. Video games, not so much. What this meant was kids who were more violent around violent video games were just more violent. Okay, beep. So what this meant was the kids who were more violent around violent video games were just generally more violent. And it would be like taking a bunch of left-handed people that were also illiterate and then showing them that they were poor spellers and concluded that it was because they were left-handed. They were poor spellers because they were illiterate, and they just happened to be left-handed. The violent people just happened to be playing violent video games. They were doing aggressive things because their life circumstances fostered aggression. That simple. Again, mental health, home life. Seems to be a running theme here.
That pretty much accounts for it whenever they look for it. A 2015 study by Markey and colleagues in a journal published by the American Psychological Association conducted 4 time series analyses on violent crimes and video games and found not only that there was no link, but they reported being surprised when they found a negative correlation between video games and violence, meaning that violent video games were actually playing violent video games and contact and experience with them was actually correlated with decreases in violent behavior.
I just, it just makes me go back to, like, politicians need to take basic science tests. Like, they've got to be able to make laws on stuff. They just got to be able to pass a basic science test. Like, you have to be able to read an article and interpret it. And if you can't do that, then you don't get to make decisions on this.
Sure.
All right. So another 2015 study had participants play games that were either violent or nonviolent and intuitive and easy to play, or violent or nonviolent, but difficult and unintuitive. They found that people were more likely to be aggressive when the game was difficult, regardless of whether the game itself contained violence. So it didn't matter that it was violent. It was just kind of frustrating to play. Again, frustration tasks. Now, further, the more skilled a gamer was, beep. Further, the more skilled the gamer was, the less likely they were to be violent, even when they were playing a difficult, frustrating game. Seemingly, increased game time decreased their reactivity to frustrating situations. It's actually highlighted another potential flaw in the studies that tried to link violent video games to violence, that they either made the nonviolent games easier or at least didn't control for the difficulty of the game, which is a factor that contributed.
Yes. So, just another study showing that the more contacts people have with these, the better they are at handling frustration and situations that might otherwise invoke violent behavior in someone who is maybe predisposed toward it. Playing video games, at least in these studies, is like the third or fourth one now, seem to suggest that it actually decreased the reactivity to those types of triggers. Speaking of reactive triggers, prepare yourself for ads.
I was waiting for it.
Okay, we have yet more research history to unpack. So let's get into a 2016 by Cunningham and colleagues. This was actually intended to validate previous lab experiments that did show that violent video games increase aggressive behavior. However, Cunningham and colleagues found that not only was there no causal link between exposure to violent video games and violent crime, but there seemed to be that decrease in violent behavior from playing violent video games.
Right. And again, I think it's worth noting that, like, overall crime, we have seen for decades that, like, violent crime is decreasing, except for when we hit 2016. And some of these studies are showing that even despite that, like, slight increase in violent crimes, we're still showing kind of that trend. Now, to go further, an intensely comprehensive 2018 study by Zendel et al. Conducted a series of experiments with 3,000 participants, examining the priming effect of violence in video games, the relative violence of the video game, violent word associations, and other aggressive behaviors. So an N of 3,000, just to remind everybody. Once again, there was no correlation between exposure to violent video games and aggressiveness. None. They found none in 3,000 people.
Now, it's not worth really getting into in huge or a hugely intense way, but for those of you super nerdy people or those who are interested in the scientific process, there's been a trend recently in people pre-registering their studies. What that means is that they can't try and rewrite the outcome of their study if it doesn't show what they want it to show, because they've already basically logged it with a scientific board of people who are then kind of holding on to it. And then they kind of have to just stick to their analyses that they were going to do. So with that in mind, a 2019 study by Przybylski, yep, something like that. Imagine a lot of consonants and Y's jumbled together in a soup. And so that person and Weinstein, they went the extra mile and they pre-registered their study, which meant, as I said, committed their experimental design, hypothesis, measurement, and methods for scrutiny by a form of scientists prior to beginning data collection, so that they couldn't later change their narrative to match the data. They included 1,004 participants and analyzed real playing data to correlate the relative violence of video games and instances of violent behavior, finding again no correlation at all.
Oh man, and that's 2019. So we're getting caught up here. Now, another study compared aggressive behaviors to the reality violence using ragdoll physics, like a physics type of let's see.
Yep. Sorry.
To the violence. Okay. Beep. So another study compared aggressive behaviors to the reality of violence using ragdoll physics that uses simulations to depict realistic, lifelike movements of human bodies compared to cartoonish, unrealistic violence like GoldenEye on N64, and saw no correlation to aggressiveness based on how real it appeared. Now, other analyses, even by the Secret Service, found that school shooters played relatively fewer video games than their peers. So we're finding studies from all different communities. They're saying the same thing, except for this Anderson fella, right. that basically there is no relation.
Yeah. Okay, last point here on our scientific studies, and then we'll get to starting to turn the ship toward a conclusion. But there, I found this graph that compared the amount of money spent on video games per capita and the rates of gun violence in the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, Australia, France, Germany, South Korea, and Japan. And this actually put the United States at or tied for nearly dead last in video game spending. Those other countries outspend us by a lot, or at least maybe one tied us, but some of them, most of them outspend us by a ton on their video games, including violent video games. However, the United States had a 3 times higher rate of gun violence than all the other countries. Whereas the countries that spend the most on video games, which was Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands, had among the least gun violence. It is actually 96 times less for Japan. Now, to be fair,
that is nuts.
Yeah. So to be fair, most of the other countries only spent a little more than the United States on video games, and also had low rates of gun violence. So USA number one. I mean, it just goes to show that, like, time and time again, where there's this narrative where people just are trusting people who are not experts on it. I mean, you have this narrative that comes out from people that just don't know what they're talking about, and they glom onto it because it sounds scary and it's an easy scapegoat. And at the end of the day, they're wrong. All the data suggests otherwise. 96 times less. Yeah,
that's crazy. Oh, it's so frustrating living in a scientifically illiterate country. God.
Well, as scientists and specifically as behaviorists, let's look at this from like a behavioral perspective. And I think looking at, because I think we're going to be really grounded to like, what's really happening? What are they really doing? And getting really focused on the actual behaviors, what those behaviors look like and how they function for someone when they're playing video games, and how that relates to things like violent behavior. And I think it's important to break down what is happening behaviorally when someone's playing the game to understand its potential relation to violence and aggressive behavior.
Right. So there are things that they are doing generally, and there are things they're doing specifically. Now, specifically, when someone is playing video games, they're usually sitting or laying down. They're staring in one direction, barely blinking, pressing some buttons, moving knobs, probably drinking Code Orange Mountain Dew, and they probably snack on unhealthy foods. So that's usually like the context in which a video game is played in most situations.
Is it Code Orange? I thought, did they have Code Orange? I thought it was only Code Red.
Did I say Code Orange? I meant to say Code Red. I've been listening to the band Code Orange a lot lately, so that's probably what that is.
I thought maybe you're thinking of Agent Orange. I don't know.
There wasn't Orange Mountain Dew. I don't think it was Code Orange though.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, that was the specific part. All right. So then they control to some extent the movement of images on a screen, usually to complete some sort of task. They might see CG images of blood or other viscera or violent actions, or they might see other things, of course, like coins flying up in the air and disappearing above their heads, etc. Free Guy is kind of a fun depiction of like a lifelike depiction of video games in that way.
Yeah.
But that's sort of then what they see when they're staring ahead and blinking at the screen.
Right. Now, generally, they are often given some objective and a way to earn points or resources. Then they practice pressing buttons at time intervals to complete their objectives while earning the most points. Like, that's really kind of the thing. It's like some achievements, some points. You're trying to do some goal. Like every video game is just like a goal towards something, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're playing Animal Crossing, then it's just kind of like the most zen Nirvana game ever. It's really great. Now, often players get into a flow state in which they are primarily focused on completing their objective, whatever it may be. What their characters are doing and what they see while doing it are kind of incidental.
Yeah, it's really just about like complete thing, do thing, like whatever that might be. There's some motivation to like have objects on screen align in a particular way to produce outcome on screen. And how exactly it looks kind of doesn't matter if we're speaking generally about what the experience is of just doing it, right? So it might be things like harvesting corn or building a house. It might be things like wielding a saber to slice a bunch of people in half. The point is that you accomplish task A by doing task, or you accomplish task B by doing task A. And that's just kind of the gist of it.
Right.
So no matter,
okay, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Beep. So no matter how realistic the graphics become, we understand intuitively that it's not real. Behaviors, we aren't actually practicing those behaviors in those contexts, right? If we could learn these behaviors effectively from games, then I should be able to competently handle a gun, a sword, a boomerang, a grappling hook, an alien laser sniper, and probably fly a plane. And I can confidently tell you that I can do none of those things with any amount of competence.
Have you tried though?
just the alien laser sniper.
Yeah.
I should also be desensitive to violence, but on the contrary, as I mentioned, I'm a pacifist, and I've gotten to the point where real blood actually makes me nauseous and queasy.
Oh wow.
And I hate watching anything performed or on screen when I know or believe that someone is actually getting hurt. I don't want to watch it. Like I can't sit down and see it. I have trouble watching the news for this reason sometimes. Like I can't emotionally handle the sight of harm actually happening to people. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's fun. I don't have that gross, like not gross. I mean, like, I'm not belittling people here, but I don't have that impulse to look at gross things. I find it very, very traumatic. Not very traumatic in the sense that like other people have experienced trauma, but like I avoid it so much because it makes me feel
it's super aversive. It's super aversive for you. I get it. I think the only I never understood like pimple popping, but like one thing I do understand is like if somebody has like a dilated pore of Weiner, I'm like, okay, that looks satisfying. That looks really good. But like other than that, I'm like, yeah, I don't like gross things either. I'm less like it. Like I remember watching Fear Factor.
Yeah.
And I would gag when people would like start gagging on screen. Like I don't like watching people hurt, but like even people being uncomfortable, I'm like, oh no, I don't like that. So,
but I will quite happily like just shred the crap out of like, use my sword to dismember some alien, split them, head to tail and let their guts spill all over the ground. And like that graphic doesn't bother me in the slightest because like, I know there's a difference between that and reality, right? Like, not a big stretch. That's a very easy thing to do.
Well, and I think to your point too, like practicing the actual behaviors or even witnessing them in their actual setting are much more effective than forming those new habits. Like, so you're not going to get that from sitting and playing a video game where you're just pressing buttons, unless it's like a simulator, right? And in simulators are very different. Like when you have like flight simulators that are designed to be like a particular context and in a safe space, but simply pressing buttons in a simulation are not the same thing, particularly when the motive is actually to solve a puzzle and not just kill people. Right.
Yeah.
Like that's a very different kind of experience.
Right, exactly. Further, if the theme of the video games influences behavior, then we should have had an explosion and people starting to work on farms after Farmville came out. And
Yes.
actually, we have
Yes.
had we're struggling to find enough farmers to feed all the people in our country and in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, at the end of the day, Penn and Teller did this really interesting bit on their TV show Bullshit. When they gave a 10-year-old an assault rifle to shoot at targets, the kid pulled the trigger once, put the gun down, and started crying. The poor kid. Also, in response to politicians' asinine claims and calls to create realistic games, Penn and Teller designed a game to reflect reality, which was just an uneventful, real-time simulation of an 8-hour drive through the empty desert between Tucson, Arizona, and Las Vegas. Sounds like a blast.
Yeah, that it's like that's the whole game. You just sit on a bus, drive from point A to point B. It takes
great.
8 hours. They just have the landscape rolling slowly by as you go, and
It's fantastic. I love that.
yeah, that's a realistic video game. And I actually think that they've like updated the versions with like new graphics and stuff. I think there's actually some Easter eggs in like some of the songs that'll play. But anyway,
nice.
On the radio, that is. But yeah, and I forgot to mention when we were talking about this kid on that episode that they did, that this was a kid who loved playing like first person shooter games. And the moment this kid actually held a gun, he was like, I don't want anything to do with this. This is terrifying.
Right.
And like, yeah, it did not have the intended effect of turning him into some monster, like it hasn't for the millions of other people who also play violent video games.
Right. I have not gone to join a ninja clan to fight a rival ninja clan in eternal combat to protect the realm. That's not happened yet. So
I don't believe it.
Although
I see your membership card in the background.
Yeah. I'm hanging out with Sub-Zero because I like the color blue.
All right. Well, we should probably take a moment to recap our thoughts on this and first suffer through some more ads.
Mm.
All right, what are our take homes here? What have we learned about violence and violent video games?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is really the main take home point of all of this is that the research and our understanding of behavior pretty clearly show that there's no correlation between violent behavior and violent video games. Like we just don't see that. And if there is one, it is that there is some evidence that people playing violent video games are less likely to engage in violent behavior, less likely. But
yeah.
What does predict violent behavior is trauma, mental health issues, being a victim of or a participant of or in aggressive behaviors. Like that's what you're going to see a lot of those kind of predictors, those factors. But going after video games as the boogeyman does not lead to meaningful outcomes that protect kids. It actually takes attention away and resources away from factors that are causing violent behavior. It takes away research funds that are like, because now people are going, okay, like we got to research this to prove that you're wrong because this is very clearly wrong. And that's just more money that can be spent on doing like research that would be helpful for someone.
Yeah.
So rather than doing research on what does lead to violence and understanding those factors, we're spending all this time and wasting time on that research that shows that video games simply do not lead to violence. Time and time again, study after study. I mean, there is no other take-home point for me other than like violent behavior is not caused by video games, hands down.
Yeah, I mean,
definitively.
Yeah. I mean, things in this world will look very different if video games could be that influential. I mean, honestly, it kind of goes back to like, and we talked about the subliminal messaging in a very early episode a long time ago. And subliminal messages, like they just like if they work, the effect is so tiny. It's almost negligible, if not completely
Right.
negligible. And like you do get that little bit of a priming effect sometimes, but like the millions of dollars that you would have tried to spend on advertisements to like get subliminal messages of cost, like your return on investment is basically nothing. You just threw money out down the
Right.
toilet and flush it away. And like you can't get it with subliminal messaging, but you also don't even get it with this like explicit sort of um graphic depiction, because that's just not how behavior works. We don't learn that well from like these total mock scenarios that are just sort of problems or puzzle solving. Now you might get much better at solving puzzles, and
Sure.
probably like figuring out how like designers are going to align task B to be completed by finishing task A first, and you'll start to like look for those patterns and how those puzzles are arranged, and you'll probably get really good at that. Maybe video game players are better at escape rooms. I would love to see if someone's done that study. um
Right.
but it's just like the actual behaviors you're engaging in do not, they're not close enough. They don't simulate the scenario close enough to make it have even behavioral sense that you would have those outcomes. And then the research bears that out too.
Right. I mean, and that's the thing too. Like, we can go into anecdotal reports about like growing up in a video game generation and like the rise of like mass shootings in the last few years. Like, we can totally do that, and you could see that, like our generation of people and like the generation of kids that kind of grew up from the '80s till now grew up with video games as being kind of this like omnipresent activity that has existed. Now, you're not seeing me go out and eat a bunch of yellow dots, and you're not seeing me go join a ninja clan. We've already kind of established that, right? But the truth is like you're finding that countries that spend more time and more money on video games have less violent crime. So there's like this negative correlation. So like it's the polar opposite of what people are saying about video games in the United States. We are spending less money and having more violent crimes occur than any other country at this point in time. So it just is one of those things where I wish people would just read. Like I wish like any of these people that were like making these claims would just read.
Sure.
And they would find these answers.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we could probably, as I said at the beginning of this, we could talk about video games all day, and that would be fun. But we're going to go ahead and I think close it out now, because our objective here was to explore the research between violence and video games, and I think that we're pretty conclusively found that video games do not cause violence. And as I said, I would be compelled by sufficient evidence, and it just doesn't exist. So, like until that evidence is there, and it has a lot of other evidence to overcome at this point. I'm going to be on the side of where the science says, which is that video games do not cause violence. And I think that in closing this out, I need to pay some. We like to give recommendations. We like to recommend some things, and sometimes those recommendations are on theme. Sometimes they're completely unrelated. Mine's going to be completely unrelated. But before we get into those recommendations, I would like to say that if you liked what you heard today, you would like to support the show, you can join us on Patreon, pick up some merch. You can like and subscribe, leave a rating and review. People who join us on Patreon get these extra perks. They get early release of episodes. They get ad-free episodes. They get behind-the-scenes content. We're open to suggestions of new things people like to see. If we get enough patrons, we're going to hang out with you all. Maybe we would do something where you get to sort of sit in while we're recording, and you can sort of see the sausage being made, if that's a thing you're into.
Yeah.
And that might be a fun thing that we do for patrons. Who knows? We're up to suggestions. But you feel free to join us over there. And then I've always got to say thank you to my team: editing and production by Justin Greenhouse, writing, fact checking by Shane, Jess, and myself. And now let's get to some recommendations. Since I talked so much, why don't you go first?
All right. That works. Beep. All right, so my recommendation is very on brand. Now, because of this game, I have gone and bought a sword and a shield, and I have traveled to Hyrule. This video game is called Zelda: A Link to the Past. It is a Super Nintendo game. It is not Tears of the Kingdom, which is a new one. It is a Super Nintendo game. And I never played it when I was a kid, but I've been playing it lately, and it's really good. It's like one of the best video games I've ever played. It's so much fun. There's so much to it. And if you don't remember, like if you're not familiar with it, there's like this really cool thing where you feel like you beat the game and you beat the last boss, and then it goes like, oh, there's the Dark World. There's like 3/4 more of a game hidden in this game. It's so good. And it's like really complicated and a lot of fun in a very expansive world. So I strongly recommend it. It's so fun.
Yeah, I love that game when I was a kid. Have I recommended this yet? I don't think I have.
I don't think you have.
Okay, cool.
We talked about it a lot.
Yeah, good. Okay. Beep. Okay, I'm recommending, as I'm wont to do. Actually, I'm surprised it took me this long, but I'm recommending the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 movie. Oh my God, what a
Excellent.
excellent. So my experience of this was I loved Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one. I was like, game changer. This is like the new
Uh-huh.
direction. Volume 2, I was a little more lukewarm on. I didn't love it quite as much. It was like had a lot of fun stuff, but there were some things that I was sort of like, I don't know about all of that. But it was still good. Like it was still, perfectly great as a movie goes. I just liked
Yeah.
the first one first. The third one, wow, does it go in a different direction? And it is just it I don't know how to really just describe it, except it's so different. It's so creative. It's so I don't know. They handled it so well. I loved how they wrote the story. I loved how the adventure played out. It really felt like, let's see what else we can do with these characters beyond just put them in these situations where they're like, oh, now we're going to come together and team up and punch some people out. It's actually more
Yeah.
like, let's rally behind this other cause that's kind of incidental to the fate of the universe, but does happen to tie in with sort of the big bad. And I don't know, I just thought it was such a unique, refreshing take on the story, and I thought it was very well done. Love the characters, love the development, just really cool. So Guardians of the
Yeah.
Galaxy Volume
It
3,
was
awesome.
Yeah, it was a perfect end to that trilogy. And the Christmas special was a lot of fun too, and you saw glimpses of like leading into like the fun of the story. Like you
Yeah.
could kind of see like, it's like, oh, this is what the Guardians are about. Like they're a dysfunctional family and they work really well together when they decide to work really well together. Like you can
Yeah.
tell I think that's the thing. You can tell they all really care about each other. And
Right.
that was like a really powerful thing where the Avengers were like just like a team of people that were like big egos, right? Like that's kind of what you find. But Guardians is like they love each other. They love each other and they care about each other and they would go to the ends of the universe to do something to save just one of them. And I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah. So that's my recommendation.
I love
I
it.
think I think that is all we have for this episode. Anything else for you before we close out?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Thank you so much for recording with me today, Shane. Thank you
Did
all for
you shout
listening.
out the patrons?
Oh fuck. I meant to, because when I was going through all my things and I didn't. Um, damn it. I wondered, either we'll just put this here and that'll be fine, or Justin, if you can put this back when we shout out the patron like 5 minutes ago. That'd be great. Okay. Beep. Thanks to the people who have already supported us on Patreon, Patreon. Oh my gosh, I can talk.
Oh,
Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Josh, the Daily BA, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, and Brian. Thank you all so much for being
yes,
who you are and helping us do what we do.
absolutely.
You are why we do what we do.
Hey, yeah, that's it. See, it's like we are Groot.
Yes, we are Groot. All right. Anything else I'm forgetting before we head out, Shane?
No, that covers it.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
Cool.
All right.
Let's stop recording for patrons on this video.
Bye, patrons.
Bye.